It's been about a month since my divorce was finalized. My ex-wife got to keep the house, and between alimony and child support payments, it's been difficult to find a place to live. I knew I didn't want to move back into an apartment. That just felt too depressing, so I had to find the cheapest house I could. I found it on the east side of town. It was small, one floor and an unfinished basement. No bedroom, just a kitchen living room thing combined, distinguishable only by carpet and tile on the floor. The bathroom was in the unfinished basement, down the short flight of stairs, and believe me when I say I'd almost rather use a public bathroom. There were only 2 windows, one next to the front door, and one perpendicular to it in the kitchen. The door seemed ancient, and the handle was an old brass knob. The key to the house was one of those old-timey looking ones with the 2 main tines, and the keyhole was huge. As you might guess, around the time I moved in 3 weeks ago I was super depressed, but at least I had a bit of property and a patio I could sit on when the weather was nice. I thought about ending it all a couple of times in the past few weeks, but I always stopped myself thinking about my daughters. I wanted to see them grow up at least. So, figuring that I might as well tough it out, I decided to try to make it as comfortable as possible. I got a rescue cat from a shelter to try to cheer myself up on those lonely nights. I knew I'd go insane just watching my small TV from my bed in the living room every night. The cat was a 9-year-old female who responded to the name Darling. She was a fluffy tabby cat, and she wasn't very cuddly with me, but she wasn't aggressive either. I've had her for about 2 weeks now. I was excited when I first got her home to show her the house. To her, of course, it was a large and exciting new experience. I loved watching her explore the room, jumping up on the counter and sniffing and batting at things. She didn't explore the basement, at least not while I was awake, but she did sniff in its general direction and seemed to walk away unpleasantly. I think I was starting to grow on her about a week after the adoption. Most nights we sat next to each other on my bed while watching shadows cast by the cars going past the front window. The lights always took a similar path, from lower on the line between carpet and tile, up through the kitchen. Darling would sometimes jump after them or try to chase them, and I found it very endearing how she would dance from my small table over to the oven on the far side of the room in front of the door. Late last Friday night, I saw something very unusual. I get sleep paralysis regularly when I'm stressed out, so basically since the divorce I've been having it almost every night. I get it both when waking up and when falling asleep. And just as I was falling asleep, lying there in that paralysis, a car went by the front of the house, and it produced a shadow that looked very strange. On the far wall of the kitchen, the shadow of a woman appeared. It looked as though she were standing right in front of the front door, based on the trajectory of the light. I could tell that she had long, thin hair that dangled from ears to shoulders, and she appeared to be wearing a dress, but other than that, I couldn't make any details. It was just a shadow. I found my eyes panning across the room to examine the window to see if she was staring in, but to my surprise, the light source wasn't the window at all. It was the keyhole of the door. How was it possible for the shadow of a woman to appear inside the keyhole? For a moment I thought I had been mistaking the shape of the keyhole itself for the dress, or maybe someone had jokingly placed a small figurine of a woman in the keyhole and was shining a flashlight through? No, that would be just way too weird. The shadow on the far wall behaved just as any other shadow produced by car light would, and it veered off into the kitchen and disappeared behind some of the appliances. I could see that Darling was watching the shadow too, but she didn't treat it in any fantastical way, just as she would any other shadow. I fell asleep and forgot all about it. When I came home from work the next day, Darling seemed distressed and was meowing at me. This was pretty typical for her, as she normally ate around this time. She was even sitting in the middle of the kitchen floor by the stove. I kept my cans of cat food in the cupboard above the stove, so I figured she must be learning, getting more clever. Her meowing became more distressed as I got out a can, opened it up, and poured it into her bowl. Yeah, I know. Come here. It's all yours. Her meows got louder and longer, and she just kept staring at me, and then back to the bowl, and then back to me. I looked at her quizzically, unable to tell what was going on. She seemed very stressed and was starting to pant. I saw her try to get up, and then it looked like she couldn't, like she was caught on something, and she limped back to a seated position. I noticed something glint on the floor, and I leaned in to get a closer look. There appeared to be a very strong thread that was something like fishing line, tightly anchoring Darling's foot to the tile floor. I tried to loop it from around her foot, but I was met with another nasty surprise. The thread wasn't looped around her foot. It was actually going through her skin. It wasn't fixed into some crack in the tile either. It was in the middle of an intact tile. I wondered if that had always been there and I'd never noticed it. But then again, how did it get through her actual skin? There was a bit of dried blood around the small wound, and I went to grab scissors. The wire was indeed very thick, and I had to cut from the base to get through it. As soon as Darling was free on both sides, she ran to her meal, and she didn't let me touch her foot again, so I wasn't able to remove the line. But I figured I didn't know what I was doing and it was better to call a vet anyway. They were closed for the weekend, but I managed to get a Monday appointment. It didn't seem like the thread was distressing her too much anyway, or impairing her movements. It really just made me feel uneasy thinking about how that had happened. I got some food in me myself, and we spent the evening as we normally did, watching the shadows pass. As I was falling asleep, I had sleep paralysis again. Although I hadn't seen a single shadow that looked like this one all evening, I saw the shadow of the woman again. It was almost as though it waited until I was paralyzed to emerge. It was on the far side of the room, just under the window by the basement stairs. In fact, it nearly looked like someone was climbing the stairs, walking across the room and then phasing into the counter, the opposite direction to which most of the shadows moved. In the shadow, I could make out the profile of her long, crooked nose, suggesting that she wasn't looking at me. The only new thing I noticed, in addition to how she appeared to me last time, was that she appeared to be holding a large needle and thread. When I awoke in the morning, I looked all through the basement and checked the kitchen cupboards. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but I felt uneasy remembering that shadow. I'd had plenty of hallucinations in my sleep paralysis before, but something felt different about this. I had trained myself to recognize what was real and what wasn't, and this felt real. Darling seemed plenty calm the whole morning though, so I felt like it was safe to go to work, and when I returned home at the end of the day, Darling was still walking around and seemed calm. Everything was well. I had got myself a pizza, as was my Saturday tradition, and I put a can of food in Darling's bowl, but she wouldn't eat. She kept hissing at the bowl, or rather, at the stove next to it. A couple times it looked like she was about to eat, and then she jumped back violently and meowed. I was beginning to lose my appetite, feeling fear. What on earth could be back there? I put the slice in my hand down and got to my feet. I went and grabbed a knife out of the kitchen drawer. Maybe it was a huge rat or something. I really didn't know what to expect. I angled myself to peer behind the oven, and Darling seemed to mimic me. The more suspicious I became, the more calm Darling seemed to become, and after a few minutes I dropped it, and she was eating in peace. I set my knife down on the table beside my pizza and started eating as well, when suddenly, Darling hissed and then screeched violently. I only saw it in my peripheral vision, but it looked like a shadow had reached out from around the back of the oven onto the floor, grabbed Darling's foot, pulled her towards the wall, and then sewn her into it. She was showing her fangs and claws and trying desperately to turn around to fight her invisible pursuer, but her right thigh was held fast to the wall. I didn't waste any time in getting up with my knife, and I pulled the oven out from the wall, but there was nothing there. I looked all around me, panting extremely hard as if to mimic Darling, but I couldn't see any threats. I pressed the knife flush with the wall and carefully freed Darling, cutting along the thick fishing line. She ran onto the bed limping and hid under the covers. My heart was still pounding. It didn't feel like it was right to sit down or keep eating. I just kept looking around. There was so much stress in my body, but honestly I think I was so used to that at this point that I didn't really pay it much mind. When I thought about moving or getting out of there, all I could think was the money troubles. Everything I had I needed for the mortgage on this terrible place. I couldn't even afford one night at a motel. I went over to my bed and tried to comfort Darling, but she hissed at me as well. I realized I was going to have to move into an apartment, but that wasn't something I could do tonight. My brain was so fried, to be honest, I don't really know what I was thinking. But hours passed, and again, Darling's newfound calm was giving me calm. Despite all of the wires sticking out of her leg and foot, I decided to stay nearer to her, at least as near as she'd let me be. Whatever that thing was, it seemed to prefer to pick on her, and it probably wouldn't try its hand with me. I was exhausted and collapsed into my bed face first. But in the middle of the night, I awoke on my back, in sleep paralysis. There was no shadow this time, but rather a clearly visible woman standing at the foot of my bed. She had a long, crooked, hooked nose and thin, stringy, long gray hair. Her pupils were the size of pinholes, and she looked like she didn't have eyelids. Her gums seemed to have receded as well, and her lips were drawn back in a freakish, decayed tooth expression that really looked more skeletal than any kind of emotion. She had on a long, torn, gray, ugly dress, and she looked to be about 60 years of age. She was holding a large needle and thread, or rather, a fishing line. She approached me, and Darling hissed and ran away. She leaned over me, and I was terrified. This especially did not feel like most sleep paralysis hallucinations I had had before, and rather than suffocating me by pushing down on my chest as most of my demons did, she instead used the fishing line as a garroting wire, pushing it down against my throat, strangling me and cutting through the tissue at the same time. I couldn't breathe, and finally, as I came out of my sleep paralysis, the vision of the woman before my face faded. Yet, there was still a fishing line cutting into my neck and pulling it into the mattress. I managed to get my fingers under the wire, and the tugging stopped. But I was still trapped there. I imagined that the ends of the line were now fixed into the mattress the same weird way that the line had been fixed into the tile when bound through Darling's foot. Luckily, I had fallen asleep next to the knife I was holding when I passed out, and I was able to free myself. I gave Darling away to a friend for now while I get my moves sorted out, and I've been living in my car for the time being. None of the research I've done on any type of spirit or cryptid matches the description of what's living in my house perfectly, but I think that it best matches a Kikimora. An old woman who lives behind the stove, enters through the keyhole of your house, and is often associated with sleep paralysis. If anyone knows anything more, I could use some help. Thanks for listening, guys. I'm really enjoying writing these stories about different European folklore creatures or cryptids or spirits and all these sorts of things. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss next Thursday's video, and tune in on Sunday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Nightmare Theater, an open book club for nightmares. You can also submit your nightmares to theforgottengrove@gmail.com, and I'd love to read them on air. I can credit you or keep you anonymous, however you'd like to do it. And until next time, embrace the beautiful dark.